The heat that settled over the fairgrounds that August morning was not the ordinary heat of summer. It was the heat of a door left open to a kiln, and it pressed against the assembled crowd with the flat insistence of something that had decided to stay. 300 people had come to the Millard County Livestock Pavilion, some of them driving 2 hours on roads that had cracked open like old pottery since April, and they stood now in the shade of the aluminum roof with their programs rolled into cylinders and their boots already white with the fine powder that used to be topsoil. They were waiting on one woman. They had spent the better part of 3 years deciding what she was, and they had been wrong in every particular. And they knew it, and the knowing sat on them the way the heat did, with a weight that had no clear source and no clear remedy. She stood at the back of the holding pen in her good boots and her plain canvas work shirt, one hand resting on the gatepost, looking at nothing anyone else could see. The people who wanted to buy what she had were in the front rows. The people who had tried to take it from her were somewhere in the middle, dressed well and quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of the morning. And Dorinda Vass did not look at any of them. She looked at her cattle. She was counting, the way she had been counting since the first week, only now the numbers did not frighten her. They had a different quality to them now, a settled and vindicated quality, like a column of figures that has been checked twice and found to be correct both times. The auctioneer cleared his throat into the microphone, and the sound rolled through the pavilion and out into the white bright day. And everyone waited. The real verdict, though, had not been made that morning, and it had not been made by anyone in that pavilion. It had been made in the first months, in the cold, by the cattle themselves, on a hillside that everyone had agreed was good for nothing. It had been made in silence, with no witnesses but a 9-year-old boy and an old Norwegian woman who smelled of coffee and pine tar soap. And it had been as final and as quiet as the land always is when it makes up its mind about a person. 3 years and 4 months before that morning, Dorinda Vass had arrived in Garfield County in a 10-year-old pickup truck with a livestock trailer bouncing behind it that contained 11 head of cattle and most of what she owned. She was 34 years old. She had $7,400 in a checking account in a bank in a town she was already 2 states away from, and she had paid $3,800 for 86 acres of red clay hillside that a succession of 3 owners had walked away from in the previous decade. The land had been listed so long on the county assessor's site that the agent had stopped returning calls about it. She had seen it on a Tuesday in March and signed for it on a Friday, and been on the road by Saturday, which was the kind of timeline that the people who later judged her most harshly had cited as the first and clearest evidence that she did not know what she was doing. The 11 cattle in the trailer were not admired animals. 7 of them were sound enough, crossbred commercial cows she had bought affordably at a dispersal sale. But 4 of them were the ones that mattered, though she did not know that yet, not fully. She had bought them at the kill pen gate at a sale barn in a county she was passing through on a drive to nowhere in particular, which is to say, she had been driving the back roads with the formless intention of a person who has just ended something and has not yet begun something else. The kill pen is where the animals go that are not expected to go anywhere after, and the 4 she pulled from it were not expected animals. The largest of them was a red and white speckled heifer, long in the leg and odd in her proportions, with a head that was slightly too refined for her frame and eyes the color of creek water over copper rock. She was not what anyone would call typey. She was not what any serious cattleman would have pulled from that pen for reasons other than mercy. She had a brand on her left hip that indicated she had been rejected from a seed stock operation somewhere to the north, and the sale barn operator had accepted $8 a hundredweight for her, which, at her weight of roughly 275 pounds, came to $22, and Dorinda had paid it. The other 3 were a small-framed roan cow with a torn ear, her 6-month-old bull calf, and a pale-faced heifer yearling whose feet had grown uneven from standing too long on concrete. None of them looked like the future. None of them, to any eye that was accustomed to looking at cattle through the lens of what was fashionable and profitable, looked like much of anything. The first morning she ran them onto the Garfield County land. She stood at the top of the hill and watched them move out into the brown and unpromising grass. And she did the arithmetic of her situation. She had $3,600 remaining. She had no operating loan. She had no husband and no partner, and no nearby family, and no local history. She had a house on the property that had one functioning door and a roof that held over roughly 2/3 of its surface area. She had 11 animals that needed to eat through what looked like the tail end of a hard winter. She had a hill that had broken 3 owners. The numbers, arranged plainly in a row, added up to a conclusion that most people would have recognized and accepted. Dorinda Vass looked at the numbers, took a long breath of the cedar-cold morning air, and started walking the fence line to see where it held. It was at the Canaan Flat feed store 6 days later that she encountered the community's opinion of her situation. She had driven in for mineral blocks and a bag of ear tags, and the 3 men talking by the loading dock did not stop talking when she pulled up, which told her either that they did not care she could hear them or that they preferred she did. "A woman alone out at the Heddick place," one of them was saying. The Heddick place being how they still referred to her land, after the name of the last man to have failed on it. Paid $4,000 for 86 acres of red clay and sorry timber, and she brought cattle with her, and I heard 2 of them were from the kill pen at the Salyer barn. The second man shook his head with the thoughtful deliberateness of a person who has assembled all available evidence. "That right there is a woman who doesn't know what she doesn't know." The third man, who said nothing, at least had the decency to look at the ground. She carried her mineral blocks without asking for help and loaded them into the truck bed herself, and she drove the 22 miles back to her land without the radio on, listening to the trailer rattle, doing the arithmetic again. 2 weeks after that, a man named Clifton Searle came to her gate in a car that cost more than her land. He was the regional acquisitions coordinator for a consortium called Consolidated Land and Livestock Partners, which was a name that explained itself perfectly if you understood that consolid is what happens to smaller things when a larger thing wants them. He was amiable and well-pressed, and he spoke with the practiced warmth of a person who has learned to use friendliness as a measuring instrument. He walked her fence line with her, admired the view from the top hill with a gesture that managed to imply it was the only thing of value, and over a cup of coffee at her doorless kitchen table, he made her an offer of $8,500 for the property and what he called a fair day's pay for the livestock. She asked him what he meant by a fair day's pay. He told her he could see she was attached to the animals, and he'd be generous. He would call it $1,400 for the whole lot of them. She told him she appreciated him driving out. He smiled and left a card and told her the offer was good until whenever she came to her senses, which was the kind of joke that is not a joke. She put the card on the windowsill above the kitchen sink and looked at it every morning for a week. Then she moved it to the trash and did not look at it again. The first 3 months were the hardest, by a measure she had not anticipated. The house was cold, and the roof leaked in a 7th place she had not found on her initial survey, and the water line to the stock tank froze twice in late April, which should not have been possible, but was. She was burning through her remaining money at a rate that the arithmetic described with humiliating clarity, and the cattle were just maintaining, on the dry hillside grass and the hay she was buying, at prices that punished her for not having grown her own. She was moving 112 bales a month at $8.50 a bale, which came to $952, which was a number that did not permit her to feel comfortable with anything. The speckled heifer she had paid $22 for was the one she watched most. There was something in the animal's constitution that she could not name, but could not dismiss. The heifer moved differently than the others, not faster or more dramatically, but with a quality of attention that was unusual in a young animal. She would stand at the top of the east hill for long periods in the early morning, facing into whatever wind there was, and she would stand there so quietly and so long that birds would land on the fence post beside her without alarm. Dorinda had started calling her Copper for the color of her eyes, which she knew was the kind of sentimental thing that the men at the feed store loading dock would have found confirming of their low assessment. It was on a morning in early May, with the ground still cold enough to hold boot prints from the night before, that she found Copper standing at the far northeast corner of the east pasture, not grazing, not watching the wind, but standing with her nose to a particular patch of bare ground in a low draw behind the old cedar stand. Dorinda walked to her and stood beside her and looked at the ground where the heifer was attending, and she saw that the ground there was wet. Not rain-wet, but wet from beneath. A slow, persistent upwelling of moisture in a draw that had been dismissed as a drainage problem by every previous owner and dug around and filled and dismissed again. She dug there with a fence post bar for 40 minutes and hit water at a depth of 31 inches. Not surface water. Cold water with a mineral taste to it and a steadiness that spoke of something deep and old and entirely indifferent to the drought that had been building in the surrounding counties for the better part of 2 years. She sat in the dirt beside the seep for a long time. The heifer had moved off to graze. The arithmetic revised itself in her mind, slowly, the way a room looks different after someone opens a window, not transformed, but entirely changed. It was Astrid Moen who came to her gate the following week. Astrid Moen was 81 years old and had been on her 40-acre place on the Canaan Flat Road since before any of the families who pitied Dorinda had been in the county. She was Norwegian by birth and by stubbornness, and by a relationship with cold weather and difficult ground that others tended to describe as obstinance, and she described as listening. She came in a truck that was older than Dorinda's, and she brought a jar of honey from her own hives and a small sack of something she called a mineral drench, that she said was an old recipe from her grandmother's dairy operation outside Trondheim. She said she would teach Dorinda to make it if she wanted. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at the land through the window that still had no curtain on it. "What do you do with a hillside that doesn't want to grow grass?" Dorinda asked, because she was tired of making conversation around the actual question. Astrid looked at her for a moment with the steady regard of a person who is deciding whether someone is worth the truth. She said, "You stop asking the hillside to be something it isn't, and you figure out what it already is." She said that the land speaks in the language of what it grows, and what it holds, and what it lets through, and that most people who have trouble with land are people who came with a sentence already written that they are trying to make the land say. She said, "A hillside that makes poor hay makes sometimes excellent browse, and a draw that floods makes sometimes excellent pasture in a dry year, and a hill that the sun hits before anything else in the morning is a hill that dries early, and cattle that dry early move early, and cattle that move early take in more across a day than anyone standing still with a clipboard can calculate." She did not say any of this in a lecture. She said it the way someone says something they have known so long it has gone simple and plain in the saying, "The way water flows because it has always flowed and does not require a reason." Before she left, Astrid looked at Copper standing at the fence. She looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "Where did you find that one?" Dorinda told her. Astrid nodded slowly and said, "You want to know what that heifer is before you decide what she isn't." Then she got in her truck and drove away, and Dorinda stood at the gate in the lengthening afternoon and felt, for the first time since she had arrived, that she was not entirely alone. The boy came in June. He was 9 years old, and his name was Rayford Puckett, and he lived a mile and a half down the road in a house that had its own difficulties, the chief one being that his father had been gone for 8 months, and his mother was working double shifts at the county hospital laundry. and there was no particular arrangement for the hours between 3:30 in the afternoon and 6. He appeared at Dorinda's gate one Tuesday without announcement and watched her work the water line to the east tank for 40 minutes before she acknowledged him, not because she had not seen him, but because she wanted to know whether he would stay if ignored. He stayed. She handed him the far end of a coil of garden hose and told him to hold it out of the mud, and he did that without being asked again. After that, he came every afternoon that she did not specifically turn him away, which she never did. He named the cattle, all 11 of them, within a week. The names were not clever names or sentimental names. They were the names of things he apparently found significant. Concrete, which was the big roan bull calf, and Tuesday, which was a cow who had freshened on a Tuesday, and Copper, whose name he arrived at independently on the third day, which confirmed something for Dorinda, though she did not say so. He called the pale-footed heifer Sidewalk, and the name was exactly right in a way that she could not have improved on if she had thought about it for a week. In July, Dorinda began to understand what Astrid had told her about the hillside. She watched the cattle. Specifically, she watched Copper, and she stopped managing the pasture rotation the way she had been managing it, which was the way she had read about in extension service pamphlets written for land that was not her land. She let Copper decide. She opened the gate to the cedar-covered east slope, which she had been saving and which looked unpromising, and she watched the cattle move into it, and she watched Copper walk directly to the browse line along the cedars and begin working the low growth with the systematic efficiency of an animal that had been thinking about this for some time. What Dorinda had thought was poor timber cover was, at the lower browse level, a dense and apparently nutritious mixture of shrub and forb that the extension pamphlets did not mention because the extension pamphlets were not written for hillsides in Garfield County. The cattle gained weight on it at a rate that did not agree with what she should have expected. Copper gained the most. By August, the heifer that had looked odd and overly refined was beginning to look something else entirely, and the something else was a word Dorinda did not let herself think yet. Rayford noticed first. He was leaning on the fence one late afternoon, watching Copper move through the lower draw, and he said, without looking up, "She walks like she knows she's worth something." Dorinda said, "Most things do when you stop trying to talk them out of it." She kept the seep quiet. She had dug it out into a proper collection pool, lined it with flagstone she pulled from the hillside, and run a buried line from it to the east stock tank, and the east stock tank had not needed supplemental filling since June. She had not told anyone. The water table under her northeast draw, she now believed, was connected to the old limestone shelf that ran under the whole east ridge of the county, which meant it was not dependent on rainfall in any ordinary sense. It would hold regardless. It would hold through whatever was coming. She knew what was coming because she had looked at the sky every morning for 3 months, and the sky had a particular white bright quality that spoke of something the county had not seen in the better part of a decade. She banked the knowledge of the seep the way you bank a coal under ash, keeping it covered and quiet and alive until the moment when the heat around it had grown sufficient to make its warmth matter. By September, Copper had grown into herself. The refinement that had looked like a flaw was now visible as something else, a structural quality, a precision of bone and muscle that Dorinda had begun to understand was the signature of the seed stock operation that had inexplicably culled her. She had found the brand number in a registry database late one night on the spotty satellite internet, and she had followed it back to a closed-out operation that had been running a particular line of registered cattle with a long and well-documented pedigree before the owner's estate was settled and the records scattered. What had come to the kill pen was the last of a line that nobody had noticed, because the animal that carried it had been born cross-typed and odd-looking in a year when the operation was already in its final months. She had been culled on appearance by a man who was winding things down and not looking carefully. The pedigree, cross-referenced through 3 separate registries, with 3 separate passwords that Dorinda acquired by emailing 3 separate breed association offices and explaining her situation with patient and detailed precision, was not the pedigree of a kill pen animal. The pedigree was the kind that changes the arithmetic of everything. She did not tell anyone. She ordered the registration paperwork quietly through the mail, and she paid the transfer fee of $65, and she put the papers in a fireproof box under her bed, and she went to sleep. In October, a woman named Greta Halverson stopped at Dorinda's gate. Greta Halverson was a buyer for a lodge operation in a neighboring state that supplied a restaurant clientele that paid attention to provenance and genetics and the particular quality of beef that comes from animals that have browsed on diverse wild forage. She had been following a particular bloodline through the registry records for a cookery project, and the trail had ended, she said, here. She was well-dressed and practical, and she looked at Copper for a long time without saying anything, and then she looked at the bull calf that Copper was likely to be bred to in the spring, and she made an offer for Copper's first calf at a price per pound that Dorinda declined to write down at the time, because she did not want the number on paper where it might seem like a temptation. It was 4 times the going rate for commercial beef. It was the kind of number that does not happen to people on the Heddick place. Dorinda thanked her and took the contact information and shook her hand and said she would be in touch when the time came. Greta looked at the hillside and at the cattle on the hillside, and she said, "Whoever put that heifer in a kill pen was not paying attention." Dorinda said, "A lot of people pay for what they don't pay attention to." Greta drove away, and the afternoon was very still, and Dorinda stood in it for a while and let the quiet settle over her like something earned. The drought arrived the following spring with the complete and indifferent thoroughness of a geological event. It did not build gradually in the way that droughts are sometimes described as building. It arrived in the last week of March as a shift in the quality of the air, a dryness that was not the dryness of cold, but the dryness of a decision. And by the middle of April, the creeks that fed the 3 main valleys in the county had dropped to a level that people were photographing and texting to each other as evidence of something they had never expected to see. By May, the main stock ponds on the flat farms were at 40%. By June, they were at 20%. By July, they were at the bottom, and the bottom was cracked and pale, and it had the look of something that had been waiting a long time to show its true face. The conventional operations in the county were in serious trouble. The operations that ran on surface water and irrigated hay ground were in the worst trouble, and the worst of the worst were the consolidation operations that Clifton Searles Consortium had been assembling for the past several years, with the brisk confidence of people who believe that size is its own answer to every question. Searle had, in the previous 18 months, acquired or optioned 4 properties in the flat-bottom land to the west of Dorinda's Ridge, combining them under a single operating plan that was efficient and well capitalized and entirely dependent on the creek system that now ran at a trickle through clay. He had 1,500 head of commercial cattle on ground that could not support them, and he had a hay price that had doubled in 60 days, and he had a water problem that his operating plan had not anticipated because it had been written by people who looked at 5-year averages and did not look at hillsides. He came to her gate in June. The car was the same one, but he had arrived earlier in the day than she expected, and he had brought a lawyer in a second car, which told her how the conversation was going to go. He was friendly in the way that people are friendly when they have decided that friendliness has a particular job to do, and they are prepared to do it thoroughly. He talked about the drought in the tone of a man who is describing shared suffering when he is in fact describing only his own. And he talked about community and about the hard times falling on everyone equally. And then he made his offer. He had upgraded it from the original $8,500 to $31,000 for the land and what he called the whole operation. He said the livestock market was distressed right now, and he was doing her a kindness, offering to step in before it got worse. He said 31,000 was fair, and the lawyer nodded at the appropriate moment. She asked him where he got 31,000. He said it was a professional assessment. She asked him what that assessment had looked like, whether it had included a survey of the water situation on the property. He said, of course, he'd reviewed the county assessor's hydrology data for the whole ridge. She asked him which data specifically, and he said the standard survey, the one from 9 years prior, which was the last comprehensive survey on record. She said yes, that survey would show what he'd described. She said she appreciated the offer, and she declined it. He leaned forward then, and his friendliness shifted into a register that was still warm, but was warm in the way that a stovetop is warm, and he said he wanted her to understand that the county had been discussing a temporary water-sharing ordinance for emergency drought conditions, and that under such an ordinance, certain water sources on private land above a minimum yield threshold might be subject to community access requirements, and that she should probably think about whether she would rather cooperate voluntarily or navigate that process with legal assistance. She looked at him for a while. She said, "What yield threshold?" He said the ordinance as proposed would apply to sources yielding over 30 gallons per minute. She said she appreciated him clarifying the threshold. He stood and buttoned his jacket and said he'd give her a few days, and she should call his office. After he left, she called Astrid Moen. She told her what had been proposed. Astrid was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How does he know about the water?" Dorinda said she had been wondering the same thing. She said the survey from 9 years ago would show nothing, because the seep had been dismissed as a drainage problem in every previous assessment. She said the only way Searle could have named a threshold of 30 gallons per minute was if he had commissioned a recent measurement. She said the only way to commission a recent measurement of her property without her knowledge was to enter the property without her permission. Astrid said, "A man who enters your land to measure what you haven't told him is a man who has already told you everything you need to know about him?" Dorinda said, "Yes, ma'am, that's about where I've arrived." The meeting at the county pavilion had been called ostensibly as a community drought response forum, organized by the county extension office at the request of several large landholders, of whom Searle's consortium was the largest. It was a Tuesday in August, and the 300 people who came were people in genuine distress and people who smelled an opportunity in the distress of others, and a small number who were simply curious. And Rayford Puckett, who was now 12 years old, sat in the back row because his mother had told him he could come if he sat still. Clifton Searle had arrived early and positioned himself near the extension office table with a prepared handout outlining the emergency water sharing ordinance proposal, which he had apparently drafted or caused to be drafted before the meeting was formally announced. Dorinda had arrived early as well, but she had gone directly to the livestock holding pen at the back of the pavilion, where she had 8 of her cattle, including Copper and Copper's first heifer calf, who was 6 months old and built like a small engine of indisputable quality. She stood there because it was where she was comfortable and because it was the right place to be for what was about to happen. The extension agent ran through the drought statistics, which were the statistics of a serious and worsening situation. Creek levels down 60% from the 10-year average, stock pond capacity in the valley floor at 12%, hay prices at 215% of the previous year's price, projected shortfall in county cattle water supply through the remainder of the dry season estimated at 342,000 gallons per week. 342,000 gallons per week. The number landed on the room the way a large stone lands on still water, and the ripples it made were visible in the faces of the people who were doing the arithmetic of what that meant for their operations. Dorinda was doing the arithmetic too. Her seep, which she had tested with a collection barrel in November and again in April, yielded 46 gallons per minute under ordinary conditions and had shown no decline since the drought began, because it was not ordinary surface water. 46 gallons per minute over a 7-day week was 66,240 gallons. She could supply roughly 19% of the county's projected shortfall from a single source on 86 acres that everyone had agreed was good for nothing. Clifton Searle stood up when the extension agent finished, and he spoke smoothly and at some length about community and shared obligation and the particular responsibility of those who had been fortunate enough to have resources in a time of shared shortage. He proposed the water-sharing ordinance with the air of a man performing a public generosity while simultaneously adjusting the controls of a machine that is working in his favor. The ordinance as he had drafted it would require water sources above the 30-gallon-per-minute threshold to be made available for community access at a rate set by a county committee, which committee he had helpfully provided a list of suggested members for, all of whom were affiliated with his consortium or its associated operations. He said the cost of access would be assessed at fair market rate for drought emergency water, which his handout suggested was a rate that would have made the access available to his consortium at a significant discount relative to what he had been paying for trucked water, while being priced too high for most of the smaller operations in the room to afford without financial assistance that would require them to enter agreements with, as it happened, his consortium. Dorinda came in from the holding pen when he finished. She walked to the front of the room and she said she had something to say about the ordinance proposal. The room shifted. She was known to everyone there, known in the way that someone is known who has been the subject of a particular kind of conversation, and the quality of the room's attention had the texture of people who are not certain they are going to be comfortable with what happens next. She said she had a question for Mr. Searle. She said she understood the ordinance applied to sources above 30 gallons per minute. She said she was curious how he had arrived at that specific threshold, and whether he had done a survey of potential water sources in the county to establish that number. He said that was a reasonable question, and that, yes, a survey had informed the proposal, a professional hydrological assessment that he had commissioned for the public good. She asked him when that assessment had been conducted. He said the previous spring. She asked him whether the assessment had included a survey of the seep source on the northeast draw of her property, which was the 86 acres on the east ridge that he had attempted to purchase from her 14 months prior. He paused, and the pause was a small and devastating thing. He said the survey was comprehensive. She said she wanted to understand, because she had not authorized any survey of her property, and the county assessor's hydrology data for that parcel was 9 years old and showed no viable water source above 5 gallons per minute. So she was wondering how a recent professional assessment of her specific parcel had been conducted without her knowledge or her permission. The pause this time was not small. In the back row, Rayford Puckett had stopped swinging his feet. Astrid Moen, who was sitting at the near end of the third row, folded her hands in her lap with the patient satisfaction of a person watching something she had expected arrive exactly when she expected it. Clifton Searle said that the assessment had been conducted from adjacent properties and from road-accessible vantage points. She said she understood, and she said that was very interesting, because the seep source on her northeast draw was not visible from any adjacent property or from any road-accessible vantage point. It was visible only from within her property, in a low draw behind the cedar stand, and specifically, it was only identifiable as a water source rather than a drainage problem by direct observation on the ground at the source itself. The room understood what she was saying before she finished saying it, and the understanding moved through it visibly, a current of comprehension that shifted how people were sitting in their chairs. She said she was not going to pursue the question of how the survey had been conducted because she did not think it was the most important thing to deal with that morning. She said she wanted to talk about the water. She said she had a water source on her property that yielded 46 gallons per minute and had shown no decline in yield since the previous October, which was before the drought had established itself in the valley. She said she believed the source was connected to the deep limestone shelf under the east ridge and would not be significantly affected by surface drought conditions for the foreseeable future. She said she had thought carefully about what to do with that source in a time of shortage. She said she was not going to place it under an ordinance that would allow a county committee to set access rates. She said she was not going to sell access to it at drought emergency market rates. She said she was not going to transfer the property to any outside entity. She said she was going to offer the water to every livestock operation in the county that needed it, on a schedule that her property could reasonably support, at a price of $0 per gallon and a contribution of whatever labor the receiving operation could provide to maintain the access infrastructure, because water that the land offers to you freely is not water you earned, and a person who charges for what they were given rather than what they made is doing the arithmetic wrong. She said she had one condition. She said the condition was that no water from her source would be made available to any operation under the management of Consolidated Land and Livestock Partners or its affiliates, not because she wished those cattle to suffer, which she did not, but because she did not believe in providing resources at public cost to operations that had attempted to acquire those resources through means she did not respect, and she believed the community was capable of making its own judgment about the rest. The community made its judgment immediately, and it was the kind of judgment that does not require deliberation because the deliberation has already been done quietly over a long time by everyone in the room. Clifton Searle stood for a moment in the front of the pavilion with his handouts and his lawyer, and the expression of a man who has operated with the confidence that the world is a mechanism that behaves according to his understanding of mechanisms, and now the mechanism has done something he did not predict. He gathered his papers. He said something to his lawyer that no one heard. He left before the extension agent had finished thanking Dorinda, and his departure was noted and not lamented. Harold Briggs, who ran the largest commercial cow-calf operation on the valley floor, and who had been the second man on the loading dock at the feed store 3 years and 4 months prior, the man who had said most carefully and most authoritatively that a woman alone on the Heddick place with kill-pen cattle was a woman who didn't know what she didn't know, Harold Briggs stood up from his chair and removed his hat and held it at his side, and thanked her for what she was offering and what she was doing, and said he would send 2 of his men Monday morning to help with whatever she needed on the infrastructure, and they would come every week for as long as the situation required. He did not apologize. She did not require him to. She nodded at him, and he nodded back, and the thing between them was not quite friendship yet, but it was the beginning of the ground that friendship grows from. After the meeting broke up and the people had filed out into the bright crushing heat of the August morning, Rayford Puckett came and stood next to Dorinda at the gate of the holding pen. He looked at Copper's heifer calf, who was looking back at him with the same Copper Creek eyes her mother had, the eyes that had recognized what the northeast draw was hiding before Dorinda had thought to look. He said, "She looks just like Copper did." Dorinda said, "Yes, she does." He said, "What are you going to call her?" She said she hadn't decided. He thought about it for a moment with the seriousness he brought to the naming of animals, which was the seriousness of a person who understands that the name you give a thing is part of how you understand it. He said, "How about 31,000? She looked at him. He looked back at her without any particular expression. She laughed, which was a sound she had not made in the pavilion or in the meeting or in the months of difficulty before it. And it was a sound that surprised her a little with its quality, which was the quality of a person who has gotten somewhere and knows it. She said, "How about we call her something that looks forward instead of back?" He considered that. He said, "How about first?" She said, "That'll do." The rains came in September, a slow and settling rain that arrived on a Thursday morning and did not hurry and did not stop for 4 days. And the creeks came up and the ponds began their slow return, and the cracked ground in the valley floor softened and grew a tentative green at its edges that by October had committed itself into something unmistakably alive. The pastures on the ridge had not suffered in the same way. The cedar browse had held, and the seep had run through everything without pause or apology, and the cattle on Dorinda's 86 acres had come through the summer in better condition than they had entered it, which was a fact that the county extension agent noted in a report and attributed to what he called adaptive grazing management with strategic alternative forage utilization, which was the technical name for following copper to the cedar slope and listening to what an old Norwegian woman said about hillsides. Copper's heifer calf, registered under her pedigree and shown at the state fair the following spring at 18 months of age, was placed grand champion by a judge who had been judging cattle for 31 years, and who said afterward that he could count on one hand the number of animals he had placed in that position, and meant it without reservation. The second grand champion, 2 years after that, went to First, who was built even better than her mother, with the same copper eyes and the same quality of stillness, and who had been valued at a figure that Dorinda wrote down this time and kept in the fireproof box next to the registration papers. Astrid Moen came to the property on a warm October evening after the second championship, as she had come most October evenings for 3 years by then, and they sat outside the house, which now had a functioning door and a whole roof and a porch that Rayford and his mother and Harold Briggs's 2 sons had built in a single long Saturday in the spring. Astrid had brought honey, as she always did. She sat in the low chair and looked out at the east pasture where the cattle were settling for the evening, copper dark against the fading grass, first moving close beside her, and the whole herd arranged in the particular geography of their own community, which had its own rules and its own history and its own memory of the hill. Astrid said, "The land forgets nothing and rushes nothing, and it gives back what you bring to it in the fullness of its own time. And a person who has learned to wait on the land's time has learned the most useful thing there is." Dorinda said she thought that was probably right. Astrid said, "And a heifer from the kill pen with copper eyes. She saw the water before you did." Dorinda said, "Yes, ma'am, she did." Astrid said, "That tells you something about what seeing requires." Dorinda looked out at Copper standing at the fence in the last of the evening light, still and attentive, facing whatever was coming on the wind, and she said, "Yes, it tells you to stop deciding what something is, before it has a chance to show you." The 86 acres that had broken 3 owners held her the way ground holds when it has been listened to rather than argued with, steadily and without drama, the way the seep held through the drought, the way good cattle hold their condition through what ordinary cattle cannot endure. She was no longer a woman alone on the Heddick place. She was the woman on the east ridge with the water and the copper-eyed cattle, and that was how the county would speak of her for a long time after, and it was the right description, and she had made every word of it true by the most straightforward method available, which was to pay attention to what was already there and to wait, with patience and with faith in the arithmetic of things that take time to reveal their proper worth.